In this video, we will talk about how to factor expressions that contain fractions. So let's say we have this expression right here, 1/2 x squared plus 3x plus 4. How could we factor this expression? Well, when we're factoring, we usually like the leading coefficient, so this value right here, we like for it to be a 1, because that makes factoring a lot easier. So how could we make this a 1? Well, we could just say 1/2 divided by 1/2, or in other words, let's factor out a 1/2, because then we'll be left with x squared. So now this leading coefficient is a 1, we can imagine. Now, if we divide this term by 1/2, we have to divide all of the terms by 1/2. So what's 3 divided by 1/2? Well, let's write that over here. 3, I'll say 3 over 1 divided by 1/2. When we divide by a fraction, that's the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So the reciprocal is where you flip the numerator and the denominator. So this is the same as multiplying by 2 over 1. So 3 times 2 is 6. So 6 over 1, or just 6. So this would be plus 6x. Now, here's a trick that you can use to make this process faster. Whatever you're dividing out here, whatever fraction that you're factoring out or dividing out, all you have to do is multiply each term by the reciprocal of this fraction. So we said the reciprocal of 1/2 is just 2 over 1, or just 2. So really, we're just multiplying all the other terms by 2. So 3x times 2, that's 6x, which is the same thing that we got over here. 4 times 2 is 8, so we get plus 8. So now that this leading coefficient right here is a 1, we can factor this expression in the parentheses. So we get 1/2 times, now remember when we factor, we want to think of what values multiply to 8 but add to 6. So that would be 4 and 2. So we could rewrite this as x plus 4 and x plus 2. So this is our final answer. This is how we can factor the original expression. All right, let's try this one. Let's say we have 1/5 x squared minus 5. How can we factor this expression? Well, again, we have a fraction as the leading coefficient, and we said we like this leading coefficient to be a 1. So the way to get this to be a 1 is just to pull out this 1/5, because then we'll be left with x squared. And remember the trick that we said in the previous example, when you pull out a fraction like this, you really just need to multiply every term by the reciprocal of this fraction. So the reciprocal of 1/5 would just be 5 over 1. So we need to multiply every other term by 5. So this term negative 5 right here, we need to multiply it by 5. So that would be negative 25. Now the last step is we just need to factor this expression right here. So note that we have a difference of squares, or in other words, 25 has a perfect square root and x squared has a perfect square root. So what we can write as our final answer is 1/5 times, this just becomes x plus 5, since that's the square root of 25, and x minus 5. So that will be our final answer. All right, let's try one more example. Let's say we have 5/3 x squared plus 7/3 x minus 2. How can we factor this expression? Well, again, we'd like this leading term to be a whole number because it makes it a lot easier to factor. So what can we pull out of here to make this a whole number? Well, if we pull out a 1/3, we would be left with 5x squared. So now we have a whole number as the leading coefficient, which is what we want. And remember we said, whatever we pull out here, whatever we factor out, we're just going to multiply every other term by the reciprocal of this. So the reciprocal of 1/3 is 3 over 1, or just 3. So let's multiply this by 3 and multiply this by 3. So 7/3 times 3, or times 3 over 1, when we multiply it this way, we can cross out these 3's, and we're just left with 7 over 1, or just 7. So here we're left with plus 7x, and then we have minus 2, so minus 2 times 3 is just minus 6. The last step is we need to factor this expression inside the parentheses. So the way that we can do that is we can multiply this first leading coefficient with this last constant value. So 5 times negative 6, that's negative 30. And we need to ask ourselves, what values multiply to negative 30 but add to 7? So if we list out some multiples of 30 or negative 30, we would have 1 times 30, 2 times 15, 3 times 10, 5 times 6. So just looking at some of these values, do we see something that could multiply to negative 30 but add to 7? Well, it looks like we could do plus 10 and minus 3. So what we can write is, we'll have our 1/3 out here, 5x squared This 7x, we're going to break it up into plus 10x, and then we'll have minus 3x. So this 7 becomes this 10 and this negative 3, and then we have minus 6. So now we just need to factor these two expressions right here. So what can we pull out of there? Well, we'll have 1/3. From here we can pull out a 5x, and we'd be left with x plus 2. And then here we could pull out a negative 3, so we'll have minus 3, and we're left with x plus 2. Now notice that these two parentheses are the same, so what we can do is we can write our final answer as, we still have this 1/3, so 1/3 we'll have 5x minus 3, so let's write that, 5x minus 3, and then x plus 2. And that will be our final factored form.